Jim Willett was dying. Colon cancer was taking his life all too quickly, much too young. Jim was a member of my congregation. I had become very close friends with he and his wife Nora and their two sons, Josh and Jesse. We had walked a far too short treatment plan together. Then one day the call came. It was Nora. Dave, I think the end is here. Could you come over? Jim and Nora lived in an old schoolhouse, farmhouse on the outskirts of town, and by the time I got there, they were all of them in the bedroom. And I remember to this day where every single one of us sat. For the next 3 hours, we talked and prayed and laughed and cried together until Jim died. And when Jim died, we held hands all around his bed. And we prayed that God would hold us as close together as God was holding Jim. Folks, those 3 hours were one of the most defining acts and events of my ministry. To have been blessed by the Willett family, to be invited to take part in a profoundly intimate moment like that was precious beyond telling. I didn't know it 20 years earlier when I went to seminary. But it were moments like those that made me answer God's call to the ministry in the first place. I hated Jim's death. I battled with months with God afterward why God didn't let him live. But for those 3 hours, there was no place I'd rather be. Today's text is one of those moments. Jesus is dying. In chapter 11, he made Lazarus rose from the dead, and ever since then, he had a collision course with the cross. In chapter 13, he had his final meal. In chapter 14 through 16, he gave his final sermon. And now, in today's text, he prays to the Father. And just as the Willets allowed me into the intimate moment of their lives, so the writer of John's Gospel invites and allows us into an intimate moment between God and his Son. It is a marvelous moment. Father, the hour has come. I made known your name to the people you gave me. I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world. Holy Father, keep them in thy name, that they may be one as we are one. Do you see what Jesus is doing? He's entrusting the people who he loves the most, their hopes, their future, their very lives, to God. When Jesus does leave, the fate of the disciples will not be determined by the long-range planning team or the building committee or the governing body. It will be in the hands and grace of God. From here on, God has the world in the palm of his hand. It's a marvelous text. And I think it speaks to us in at least two ways. Number one, It invites us to see that God as imminently involved in every intimate moment of our lives. God was there when Jim Willett died. And to this day, I'm not quite sure whether I was God for them or they were God for me, or maybe a little bit of both. God is here in every prayer we pray, every tear we shed, every hope we share. God knows us all by name. He knows our deepest joys, our greatest fears. God has every one of us in the palm of God's hand. Folks, the God who created everything that there is, everything that exists, is the best friend you and I will ever have. Secondly, this story reminds us that the Lutheran Church of the Resurrection is not our church. It's never been our church. It's God's church. And the future of this congregation will be determined not by the long-range planning committee or the church council or the staff. It will be determined by the amazing grace of God. Jesus has given this place and all of us over to God. It is not our calling to grow this place. That's God's job. Our calling is to listen to, pray for, and discern God's will for this place. And then to have the courage and the commitment to make it happen. And so the question begs to be asked, do we trust God enough for that? I ask it again. Do we trust God enough for that? This is a marvelous text. Holy Father, keep them in thy name. Jesus is leaving. And he is entrusting all of us to God's care. And I am here to tell you there is no place better to be.